Good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Hart Bennett, and today I'm going to read all of Chapter 7 to you from my book, Seven Sisters, The Voyage. The saints were quite somber the rest of the day, but found they recovered much faster emotionally from the last death because of their involvement in their duties, routines, and committee work. The crew marveled at the passengers' resilience, industry, and especially the happy faces they bore as they undertook each day's activities. It really didn't make any difference to them what trials the saints were experiencing. They carried on sailing the ship, and when they had a few hours of smooth sailing, they would turn to tarring, painting, or repairing spars and rigging. There was always something that needed to be fixed or spruced up. They would often work close by the helmsman so they could include him as they spun yarns, sang shanties, and swapped stories. The sailors had several old sails from earlier voyages that needed repair, and they worked on them when they got a chance because there was always a need for backup sails if they got into a storm. Today they were working on a small sail that had several tears and a seam that had come undone. 5 of them found a spot to sit and mend. There they spread the sail over themselves like a bedspread. Several others spliced cable, and a ways away a few mates scraped the bulwark to get it ready for painting. The crew was still a strong attraction for many of the young female saints who promenaded the deck and managed to casually meander past them in their travels. Jabez noticed that Griswold seemed to be entranced as he watched the girls pass. "Griswold, you keeping an eye on the horizon?" he said as he elbowed Alfie next to him. Griswold snapped his attention back to the horizon and adjusted the helm accordingly. "Me eyes are glued there," he lied. "They sure are," razzed Jabez, who was joined by hee-hawing from the others. Griswold turned as red as the Black Ball Company issued kerchief around his neck. He knew he had been caught oogling. "Any sign of a squall?" quizzed Alfie. Trying to regain his dignity, Griswold reported. "There's a dark cloud northeast, but it's not coming our way." Titus blessedly took the attention off Griswold as he groused. "These Mormons don't know what a rough sea is like yet. If we run into a storm, they'll be praying their hearts out." Then he put his hands in a praying position and uncharacteristically spoke in falsetto. "Save us, O Lord! Thine ocean is so large, and our little boat is so small." This caused an outburst of laughter as the crew bent over and slapped their knees. Titus knew how to strike their funny bones with his sarcastic humor. It was all in his delivery. These numerous and raucous eruptions of laughter drew the saints' attention in the direction of the crew. They knew they were being mocked, but smiled and nodded politely as they told their families under their breath, "Just ignore them and smile." The twins were perched on their coiled piles of rope, basking in the warmth of the sun on their faces, when the loud laughter caught their attention. "What are they laughing at?" asked Phoebe. "They're always laughing," replied Fanny. Phoebe's face registered an idea. "Let's get closer and listen to their stories." Fanny was thrilled at the idea of this adventure as they crept forward on their hands and knees. They had plenty of obstacles to hide behind, but there were a few open spaces that they had to get across, in direct eye line of the sailors. These were tricky, but when the men would rear back with laughter, the twins would get up on their haunches and scurry to their next hiding place, where they covered their mouths to keep from laughing out loud. They finally got as close as they dared and turned their backs to sit against a large crate that was just 6 feet away from the men. They could hear everything now. There are no words more terrifying than lost at sea," said Jabez. "Aye," the sailors agreed. "I'm placing my luck on this ship," he continued. "This is my 3rd attempt to get home to New York. On my last 2 tries, the bloody ships wrecked. The last one on the fish banks of Newfoundland, not far from here." "Get the man an albatross to hang around his neck," Titus laughed mockingly. Huntley added reflectively, "For what it's worth, I've never felt as safe as when I was bringing over a ship of Mormons. They are definitely different from the immigrants I sailed with 2 seasons ago," said Griswold. "There was no organization, and we had to do all the work ourselves. These Mormon fools are earning half our wages the way they work and clean the ship," said Alfie. Again, Titus was in a praying mood as he clapped his hands together. "Thank you, saints, for lightening my load." This met with more chortling. After the Irish, I swore I'd never sign on to another immigrant ship, said Jabez. Best be careful what you say, laughed Huntley. You're probably talking about some of my relatives. Present company accepted, Huntley, said Jabez in mock apology. No offense taken, laughed Huntley with a sweeping bow. Jabez continued. We got stuck in the doldrums for 3 days and were lying like a huge mammoth of the deep, sunning itself on the bosom of its natal home. The saints chuckled knowingly. We were scarcely moving one knot, Jabez said, shuddering. It gave me a queer feeling to be so still. Griswold quoted Coleridge. Alone, alone, all alone, alone on a wide, wide sea. Jabez went on. We were almost out of food and water and had to go on half rations. I had to stand with clubs to keep the Irish in awe when we served out food and water. Aye, those were my relatives, all right, said Huntley. The crew roared. These Mormons are a peculiar people, Huntley went on. They get along with all the inconveniences existing on board a ship, and without swearing, quarreling, or fighting. Yeah, it ain't natural, said Alfie. The Mormon ship I was on went to New Orleans, and then up the Mississippi to St. Louis, said Huntley. They gave up that route a few years ago because of all the river sickness they contracted. Yellow fever and cholera killed them like flies. The twins gasped suddenly at the thought of so many saints dying, then clapped their hands over their mouths, hoping no one had heard them. But Titus had heard them and tiptoed a few steps to peek over the box. He turned to his crewmates and put his finger to his lips in the be quiet mode. His face expressed to the others that they had company and he would be taking it from here. I took cargo to New Orleans once, he said. We stopped in Haiti. Did I ever tell you the story of the Negro Emperor Christopher of the South Indies? Can't read today. Now tell us, begged Griswold, laying it on. As Titus talked, he moved closer to the box and poured on exaggerated inflections. One bright summer morning, 1,500 females, from the nursing babe to the aged and infirmed, were beheaded by orders of this fellow Christopher. The twins gasped again and stared at each other in horror. Those who were known to have a drop of white blood remaining in them all came under the axe, said Titus, his words dripping. He was almost in position. I heard that's what they do to disobedient children in Salt Lake City. Then he grabbed both twins by their arms and stood them up abruptly. A duet of screams crisscrossed each other as the twins struggled to free themselves. They started turning in circles, and to Titus's dismay, they wiggled free and ran for all they were worth to the nearest hatchway and down the stairs. The sailors were rolling on the deck by now, and Griswold was bent over the helm, completely helpless. Titus had been outmaneuvered by 10-year-olds. He looked at his cronies and scratched his head in bewilderment. He feigned disappointment at losing the twins, rubbing his eyes as though he were crying, then burst into a deep guttural laugh, drowning out the rest. Susanna and Eleanor were at their berths, getting their teapots ready to take to the galley, when the screaming twins burst through the doorway. Fanny ran behind Susanna to hide, and Phoebe could hardly speak. Susanna, Black Eye said they're going to chop off our heads with an axe. What? Susanna questioned. In Salt Lake City, said Fanny, peeking out and clinging tightly to Susanna's waist. If we're naughty, said Phoebe as she held on to the front of Susanna and looked up into her eyes. There, you're not to believe those sailors, Susanna comforted. They're just trying to frighten you, said Eleanor. Well, they're making good work of it, blubbered Fanny. Susanna turned to Eleanor. What are we going to do? The sailors just keep persecuting us. Yes, and the captain doesn't seem to be at all sympathetic to our treatment, Eleanor said. Then, gathering up her courage, Eleanor made a decision. I'll take care of this, Susanna, she said as she walked briskly to the door and up the hatchway. She scanned the deck, spied the sailors grouped together, and walked fearlessly towards them. Titus saw her first. Look who's coming, mates. Are you ready for a Scotch blessing? The sailors laughed, but not with quite as much gusto as they usually did. Titus took a step forward and crossed his arms solidly on his burly chest as she approached. His dawning frame didn't seem to deter Eleanor one jot as she spoke in a powerful yet restrained manner, her eyes flashing. I do not wish to trespass too much upon your time, Mr. Holt, realizing that you have many duties to engage your attention. But you, and all of you, she said, sweeping her finger over them, are doing your best to make our lives as miserable as you can on this voyage. We've done nothing but comply with your rules and regulations. We've kept an orderly ship and tried to stay out of your way so that you can perform your duties. There is no need to harass the saints, who are trying their utmost to be saints of the Most High in word and deed, and there is absolutely no excuse to scare the children to death. His mates wondered how he would make a comeback. Titus thought about what she had said for a few seconds and looked right and then left at his mates. Then he stepped slowly into Eleanor's space, leaned his swarthy face close to hers, and spoke slowly and odoriferously, "Go tell the fish." Eleanor winced at the rankness of his breath. The crew roared in laughter and held their sides. They had been rewarded for their wait. Titus was triumphant again. He was their hero. Eleanor exploded. "I've never met a more disagreeable lot of men in my life." And she did an about-face and stormed off toward the hatchway. Tears were trickling down her cheeks with each step. Upon entering the stairwell and out of sight, she sank to the steps and sobbed with abandon, not caring to restrain herself. After a minute or two of thoroughly feeling sorry for herself, she regained her self-control and entered the sleeping quarters. "Titus is like talking to a newborn," she said to Susanna. "Those satyrs aren't going to change for anything. You've just got to keep the twins away from them. That's all there is to it." Susanna turned to the twins and knelt down in front of them. "Do you hear that, girls?" "We'll stay away," promised Phoebe. "Far, far away," assured Fanny. Eleanor wandered over to the table located in the center of the sleeping quarters and plopped herself down in defeat. She spied a Book of Mormon that was lying on the bench. She opened it to 2 Nephi, chapter 2, and traced her finger down to verse 11. "There must needs be an opposition in all things," she read. Then she closed her eyes and repeated it over and over to convince herself. There must needs be an opposition in all things. The saints usually took much less trouble fixing their noontime meals than their breakfast or supper meals. They had activities to get back to and didn't want to spend much time waiting in long lines at the galley. The seven sisters used this extra time to catch up on what everyone else had been doing all morning and what their plans were for the afternoon. "Caroline, you haven't said much about how the 4th of July celebration is coming along," said Susanna as she nibbled on a boiled potato. "Oh, it's going to be grand," said Caroline. "It will be the best 4th of July ever." "What's so special about the 4th of July?" wondered Phoebe out loud. Susanna was amazed that Phoebe didn't know this basic historical fact. "That's when the United States of America declared independence from us," she said. "Why should we celebrate that?" asked Fanny. Eleanor explained. "Because we are going to become them." Caroline continued. "President Bramwell wants to begin with a flag ceremony and the national anthem." "God save the Queen?" piped up Phoebe, hoping she got the answer right. Susanna could see that her teaching knowledge was going to pay off with her sisters. "They don't have a queen. They have a president. President Abraham Lincoln." "Does he wear a crown?" asked Fanny. Susanna was having a hard time keeping her patience. "No, a stovepipe hat." Lavinia knew a little about the celebration plans from talking to Brother Careless, so she added to the conversation. "President Bramwell also wants a concert with a band and choir, as well as some patriotic recitations." Susanna got a faraway look on her face. "Marcus writes beautiful recitations." "Marcus?" Eleanor gently teased. I mean Elder Fielding," she said. "Then we'll have a dance till dark," said Caroline. "And here's the best part. The captain says he has some fire rockets the crew can set off." "Ooh!" squealed the twins. During this exchange, Lavinia was gathering up the tin plates and cups, since it was her turn to wash the dishes. "Humph! I've never been to a dance in my life," she said with disdain, "and I probably wouldn't get asked to dance if I did. I'd be, she searched for the words, "a deck flower." Fanny was perplexed again. "A deck flower?" Lavinia continued to collect the utensils. "It's like a wallflower, only on the ocean." Her sisters began chuckling. Lavinia could say the oddest things at the oddest times, and she always made her sisters laugh. "Even if I did get asked, well, I don't know how to dance anyway," she admitted with a touch of bitterness. Then she added, "I think the whole practice is sinful." The sisters could see this was a painful subject for Lavinia. She was, at 35 years of age, a very old spinster, by all accepted standards of the day. Caroline looked at Eleanor, Lizzie, and Susanna, and their eyes communicated what needed to happen next. Sister, she said, I think this is an invitation for us to give Lavinia some confidence in herself. Approaching Lavinia, she took the remaining dishes out of her hands and set them down. She placed her hands on Lavinia's shoulders and looked up into her face. Do you have faith, Lavinia? Yes, said Lavinia reluctantly, but I don't have faith you can make me the belle of the ball. Well, faith without works is dead, said Lizzie, so we'd better get to work. With that, Lizzie directed Lavinia to sit on the bench as Caroline walked around her and looked closely. Then, trying to be tactful about Lavinia's plain hairdo, she pulled out the hairpins from her tight bun. Lavinia, you have such pretty eyes. Perhaps we need to draw attention to them by changing your hairstyle a little. Caroline took her long dark hair and moved it around to see which style would complement Lavinia's face. Lizzie and Eleanor acted as mirrors, offering their thoughts about what looked best from their perspectives. Susanna dug into her trunk to retrieve some Sunday shawls that were nicer than her everyday ones. She draped them around Lavinia's shoulders. Ow, what are you doing? Said Lavinia as Lizzie pinched her cheeks. Giving you some color, said Lizzie, resuming her pinching. Phoebe and Fanny, Susanna directed, tear this cloth into 1-inch strips. Eleanor rounded up a bowl of water, which she set on the table. Then, with Caroline on one side and Eleanor on the other, they sectioned off Lavinia's hair and wet each piece with a comb. As they held out their hands, the twins placed a strip of cloth in each one. Next, they wound the hair around the cloth and rolled it all the way up to her scalp. They then tied it securely into a knot and left the tails flapping down. Lavinia started to protest all this attention, especially the pulling and pinching that was causing her such discomfort. Susanna continued looking through her trunk. I've got a pretty lace collar in here somewhere. Caroline continued to add little hair rolls to Lavinia's pate. And I have a lovely brooch you can borrow, Caroline said, directing Lizzie to go through her trunk. Lavinia was beginning to look like a mop with all the floppy tails spouting all over her head and drooping down into her eyes. Phoebe and Fanny couldn't help but giggle. Could someone bring me a mirror? Said Lavinia, worried about how she looked. I think it's best you don't see yourself until we get finished with you, said Lizzie, stifling a laugh as she took Lavinia's hand and led her to a small vacant space between the tables and the berths. Do you know how to skip, Lavinia? Appalled, Lavinia said with condescension, I never skip. It's fun, said Lizzie. Just step hop like this. And she skipped around in a little circle. Try it, said Eleanor, encouraging her. Oh, it's too childish. Let's all skip, said Lizzie. Come on. And all the sisters followed Lizzie in a circle. Lavinia reluctantly joined them. She felt foolish letting her inhibitions go, indulging in such silliness. But after skipping a few steps, she caught on to it and laughed with the others. This was oddly enjoyable. She swung her arms to help lift her upward as she skipped higher and higher. Not quite so high, Lavinia, Caroline said with a laugh, realizing her pupil was getting a little too rambunctious. Lavinia calmed down and made her steps smaller and daintier. That's better, said Eleanor, as all the sisters stepped to the edge of their dance area to catch their breaths. Lavinia was beginning to like this new education from her sisters. She was eager to learn the next lesson. Now, you need to learn how to slide, said Lizzie. If you know how to skip and slide, you can do almost any dance. I'll demonstrate, Lizzie said as she slid sideways in the newly cleared space. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then she slid back the other direction. 5, 6, 7, 8. It seemed simple enough. Next, she lined up all the sisters across from each other, with 3 on one side and 4 on the other. Susanna clapped the rhythm as they slid towards each other, through each other, and then reversed their direction. They had a marvelous time, especially Lavinia, who had never felt so free. As the 4th of July celebration approached, and saints scarcely thought of anything else. The anticipation of the celebration kept everyone's spirits high. Caroline was in high gear as she checked with each committee head to see that everything was organized to run smoothly. The sisters eagerly helped Caroline with anything she asked them to do. They also made sure Lavinia was ready for what might well be her coming out party. The night before the 4th, the sisters lay in their berths and jabbered about the anticipated events of the next day. Caroline kept them giddy with excitement as she described how she hoped the day would unfold. The next day was greeted with eager saints scraping and scrubbing the 'tween decks, straightening their sleeping and baggage storage areas, eating breakfast and doing their dishes. They accomplished it all much faster than usual. Mothers washed their children's faces, wet down stubborn cowlicks, and rebraided hair. Everyone put on their best clothes and buffed their shoes and boots. Before long, they were all up on deck, greeting each other with smiles and chatter as the Cardiff band played a vigorous tune and President Bramwell shook hands all around. A prayer was given, then speeches, choir numbers, and recitations followed. The captain provided Bramwell with an American flag, which Captain Larkin and his guards raised up the mast. Everyone sang the Star-Spangled Banner from their hymnals since they weren't entirely familiar with the words yet. Everyone was filled with pride that they were going to become part of a new country, America. They had heard stories of how rich and bounteous it was. They loved England with all their hearts, but they had a new life ahead of them now, and they wanted to embrace it fully. The day continued with games for the children and contests for the young people. Many sat around the deck and cheered for their favorite competitors. After the evening meal, the saints arrived back on deck for the dance. The band played again, and before long the dancers lined up and slid past each other from one side to the other as the music pounded its steady beat. Every age participated. Marcus sought out Susanna, and they danced happily with each other, laughing and enjoying the fun. The twins became partners, and when they didn't know the steps, they bounced up and down to the music until they caught on to what everyone else was doing. Several single young sisters sat on makeshift benches around the edge of the dance floor, smiling and waiting for an invitation to dance, their toes tapping in time to the music. Lavinia looked down and felt her cheeks burning. She didn't dare look up for fear she would call attention to herself. She felt conspicuous sitting there with the others and began contemplating a way to get back to her berth without being noticed by her sisters, who were all dancing and had temporarily forgotten their Pygmalion on the sidelines. Ready to make her escape, she started to lean forward to get up, when suddenly 2 black boots stepped in front of her. She froze for a moment, then sat back and looked up to see Brother George Careless standing in front of her with his hand extended. "Sister Triplet, may I have the pleasure of the next dance?" Lavinia suddenly felt weak as she took a deep breath and tried to remember the correct response to a dance invitation. I'd be delighted, Brother Careless," she said as she slowly stood up until she towered over him a half a head. It seemed to George that she would never stop rising. He smiled up at her and nervously tugged at his too tight collar. Lavinia had a complete new look, with her curly hair springing down in corkscrew curls around her face. She had advanced from wearing her usual black or dark-colored dresses to a lovely true blue skirt with a white lacy blouse. The maroon shawl from Susanna and a cameo brooch from Caroline added even more color. Her best asset, however, turned out to be her smile, which added a brightness to her face that had been lacking since she boarded the Amazon. George was undeniably enamored with Lavinia, and after a few false starts and clumsy steps, they were soon sliding and skipping around the deck with the rest of the dancers. Lavinia was happily surprised that her dancing came so easily to her. The culmination of the dance included marching towards your partner and clapping hands up high. Lavinia didn't think much about it until she held up her hands, and George had to make a little jump to reach them. She laughed sheepishly at their height difference and adjusted her hands a little lower the next time. George was having so much fun he didn't even notice. The dance ended with everyone clapping their approval. The sessions with Lavinia's sisters had paid off. The sailors on the forecastle were also enjoying the activities of the evening. Some of them danced by themselves and did some pretty fancy footwork. The captain was close by, keeping watch to see that the crew didn't wander down to the dance floor and cause problems as they did at the wedding dance. There were, however, a few young girls clapping and encouraging the crew from afar. Lizzie kept an eye out for Alfie, who must have been below deck or in the sailors' quarter because he hadn't been topside since the dance began. But after another dance finished, she spied him coming up from the hatchway with Jabez. Her heart fluttered when she caught his eye. She took the nugget out of her pocket and held it up so he could see it. He nodded his head in recognition, and they both moved toward the far end of the ship. Lavinia and George, in the meantime, leaned against the bulwark to catch their breaths after a second invigorating reel together. When Eleanor came over to congratulate Lavinia on her successful dancing experience, Lavinia hugged her tightly and whispered in her ear, "Did I say dancing was sinful? It's sinfully sensational," she said, and they both laughed. Darkness finally overtook the colorful skies, and the crew began working to get all the fire rockets in position for the grand finale. No one paid any attention to Alfie and Lizzie, who worked their way to the stern of the ship for their rendezvous. Soon the captain was ready and ordered his crew to set off the first rocket. A loud bang sent it speeding up into the air for a considerable distance, and then it came sailing down. And when it came sailing down, it left a trail of sparks for a few seconds before hitting the water. The saints whooped, clapped, and cheered with each rocket. The crew also shot off a few guns to add to the noise and excitement. The young people reveled in the loud noises, but the older saints and toddlers held their ears, and some of the babies cried furiously at each loud, startling blast. "I can only stay for a moment," said Lizzie. "I don't want you to get into trouble again." Alfie ignored Lizzie's concern as he grabbed her and kissed her fervently. Then, breaking apart, he looked into her eyes. "Lizzie, come with me to San Francisco. I think you and I want the same things." Lizzie was stunned by this offer. She had to think, but was too confused. "That won't be easy," she said. "The church has already paid my fare, and they won't like it if I don't pay them back." "Then we won't tell them," he reasoned. "You can just disappear when we get to New York." Lizzie was torn. "I don't know if I can do that." He drew her to him and kissed her again. Lizzie knew she had to have time to think about this decision clearly. "You're a mighty powerful persuader," she said. Then she was jarred to her senses. The loud popping had stopped. "Oh, the fireworks are over. I'd better get back," she said as she squeezed his hand and moved back to join the revelers. The saints had already started to vacate the deck and move down the hatchways. They were elated with the joyous day and spectacular fireworks display they had just witnessed. There were oohs and ahs and laughter and chatter. It was the best time they had had since the voyage began. Lizzie drew near the moving crowd and fell in step with them. As she turned the corner near the hatchway, she spied President Bramwell and his counselors talking to Caroline. She moved closer to hear President Bramwell say, "Sister Cleverly, that was a magnificent celebration. You are to be commended." Caroline beamed. "Why, thank you, President. Who would have thought that knowing how to throw a garden party in Lancashire would come in so handy on a ship in the middle of the ocean?" And that's the end of chapter 7. Over and